It seems like the end of the story, right? But just 20 minutes later, he owns the entire airline. How did this happen? You won't believe what he did next. Before we start the story, leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from today. We love hearing from people all around the world. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss out on more unbelievable stories like this one. It was a regular afternoon at New York's JFK Airport when a wealthy businessman, dressed in an immaculate suit, walked up to gate 23 for his flight to London. He wasn't a man who stood out in a crowd. No flashy jewelry or loud behavior. In fact, he seemed almost too ordinary for someone worth billions. He had the look of someone who was used to traveling in style but didn't need to flaunt it. His name? Charles Blackwood, a reclusive billionaire whose fortune was built on tech companies, investments, and a string of high-profile acquisitions. No one in the crowded terminal would have guessed he was a man who could change the course of an entire airline with just a phone call. As the passengers boarded the plane, Charles was one of the first to settle into his seat in business class. His flight was smooth, like every other one he had taken, until the moment he encountered a flight attendant who was having a particularly tough day. Her name was Jenna, and she had been working with the airline for over 5 years. She was young, sharp, and eager to do everything by the book. But that afternoon, her day had been full of delays and complaints, and her patience was running thin. When she reached Charles's row, she stopped and made a request that seemed perfectly routine. "Sir, you'll need to turn off your phone and put it in airplane mode," Jenna said, in a tone that was more authoritative than polite. It wasn't anything out of the ordinary. Passengers were reminded of the same thing every time they boarded a plane. But for some reason, Charles, who had been lost in a file of documents on his tablet, hadn't noticed the announcement. He glanced up at her and nodded, as most passengers would, prepared to do as instructed. However, something went wrong at that moment. Jenna, who had been under pressure all day, misinterpreted his delayed response as defiance. "Sir, I asked you to turn off your device. You need to follow the rules," she said, this time with more force. Charles looked at her, his expression calm, almost amused. He didn't speak for a moment, as though weighing his options. He didn't like to make a scene, especially when traveling, but something about the way she spoke to him rubbed him the wrong way. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't realize it was an issue. I'll turn it off now." But Jenna wasn't having it. Maybe it was the stress of the long shift or just the power she felt in that moment. But she wasn't going to back down. "You're not taking this seriously, sir. I'm going to have to ask you to leave the plane," she said, her voice more stern than before. Charles stared at her for a moment, unable to believe what he was hearing. He'd traveled across the globe for business, and no one had ever spoken to him like this. But he wasn't the type to make a scene. He stood up, grabbed his bag, and walked off the plane without a word. The other passengers watched in disbelief, unsure of what was happening, but none of them said anything. It wasn't until he stepped into the terminal, still in disbelief, that Charles realized just how serious the situation was. Jenna had gone too far, and now Charles wasn't going to let it slide. He wasn't just going to get on another flight. No, he was about to make sure this incident didn't go unnoticed. What happened next would send shockwaves through the aviation industry, and no one, not even the airline's top executives, could have predicted it. As Charles stood in the terminal, his phone rang. It was a private number, one he recognized but hadn't heard from in a while. The voice on the other end was calm but direct, a sharp contrast to the rising frustration he felt. It was his lawyer, Gregory, who had handled most of his business affairs for years. "Charles," Gregory said, "I know you don't like to get involved in these kinds of things, but I heard what happened. Do you want me to handle it, or do you want to deal with it yourself?" Charles didn't respond right away. He was still processing the events. He had been disrespected in the simplest, most public way possible, by a flight attendant of all people. Most people would have laughed it off or let it slide, but Charles wasn't like most people. His life had been a series of calculated moves, and every setback, no matter how small, had always been an opportunity. This time, however, It wasn't about profit or negotiation. It was about power, about making a statement that would be impossible to ignore. "I'm not interested in apologies or a refund for the inconvenience," Charles replied, his voice calm but with an edge of determination. "I want control. I want to own the airline. I want it in my name. Make it happen." Gregory paused for a moment as though trying to gauge whether Charles was serious. "You want to own it? The whole company?" Charles let out a quiet chuckle. "Yes, Gregory, the whole thing. I'm done being underestimated." Gregory had seen Charles make big moves before, but this one was different. It was personal, but Gregory knew that if anyone could pull this off, it was Charles. He quickly got to work, contacting key figures in the business world and reaching out to the right people to start the process. Within minutes, the legal teams were mobilized, and a plan was being put into motion. As Charles stood there, the initial frustration began to fade. It was replaced with a cold, calculated sense of purpose. He wasn't going to just let this incident slide. Instead, he was going to turn it into an opportunity that would shake the airline industry to its core. He knew it wouldn't be easy. There would be resistance. The airline's executives would fight back, and there would be legal battles to face. But Charles had the resources, the influence, and the resolve to see this through. His wealth had always been his shield, but now it was going to be his weapon. And by the time this was over, the airline that had humiliated him would be in his hands. Less than an hour later, Charles was back at his private office in Manhattan, sitting in front of a stack of papers that didn't mean much to him anymore. He'd been through hundreds of business deals, mergers, and acquisitions over the years, but nothing like this. This wasn't about buying companies for profit. It was about taking control in a way that no one would ever forget. Gregory was on the phone again, updating Charles on the progress. "I've got your offers ready," he said. "We're buying up shares of the airline as we speak. I've already got the financial backing lined up, and we'll be able to push this through in a matter of hours. But we're going to have to act fast. Once the media catches wind of this, things are going to get complicated." Charles nodded, though Gregory couldn't see him. "I don't care how complicated it gets. I want to make sure the first thing the CEO hears tomorrow morning is my name. Make sure the offer's firm. No backing out." He leaned back in his chair, looking out the window at the sprawling city below, feeling a cold determination settle in. It wasn't just about owning the airline. It was about sending a message to anyone who thought they could treat him like an outsider, like someone who could be dismissed or ignored. The flight attendant, Jenna, had no idea what she'd started. The legal team worked through the night, poring over the airline's stock options, market shares, and corporate structure. Charles's lawyers made calls to major investors, applying pressure to sell their stakes. Meanwhile, Gregory's team was orchestrating the final phase, a massive purchase of stocks that would give Charles enough power to make a hostile takeover. The clock was ticking, but Charles had no doubt it would work. He'd built his empire on quick, decisive moves, and this would be no different. By the time the morning came, the deal was almost sealed. Gregory called again, his voice tense but filled with confidence. "It's done. The airline's board of directors is already on high alert. We've made the final offer, and they'll have to respond within hours. At this point, it's a matter of waiting for them to either accept or go down fighting." Charles stood up, his mind already calculating the next move. This was only the beginning. Even if they fought back, they were already too far behind. He had everything in place, control of enough shares, legal leverage, and a strategy that would force their hand. But there was something else that lingered in his mind. The flight attendant, Jenna. Charles couldn't help but think about how insignificant she must have thought he was when she kicked him off that plane. She had no idea who he really was. And soon she would understand just how wrong she was. Charles walked over to the window, watching as the city started to wake up below him. He felt a rush of satisfaction. This wasn't just about taking over an airline. It was about rewriting the rules, about showing the world that even the smallest of slights could turn into a game-changing move. And as for the airline, it was as good as his. The next few hours were a blur of phone calls, meetings, and rapid-fire emails. Charles barely slept, his mind fixed solely on the one thing that mattered now: owning the airline. He knew this wasn't going to be a quick victory. The airline's executives were not going to roll over easily. But he had the resources, and more importantly, the drive to outlast them. By mid-morning, the first news reports hit. Mysterious billionaire makes bid for major airline following public incident, the headlines read. The story about his confrontation with the flight attendant had already made its way to the media, and as expected, it had caused a stir. What had started as a simple incident on a flight was now national news. But Charles didn't care about the press. He was already moving beyond it. His lawyers were making calls to the airline's board members, making it clear that his offer was non-negotiable. The amount he was offering for their shares was substantial, enough to push them into a corner. The airline's top executives, led by CEO David Clarkson, were now scrambling. They hadn't seen this coming. A man they assumed was just another passenger on a commercial flight had turned out to be a powerful force with the ability to shift the balance of power at will. Inside the corporate offices of the airline, chaos began to unfold. Clarkson, an experienced CEO who had led the company through ups and downs for over a decade, was in a state of disbelief. "Who is this guy?" he muttered to his team, staring at the screen showing the sudden surge in stock purchases. How did he gain this much control so fast? The executives huddled together, trying to figure out how to block the acquisition. They had already begun to call in their own legal teams, looking for ways to challenge the bid. But as they dug deeper, it became clear that Charles had planned every step of this. The shares he'd bought were locked in legally, and the terms of the takeover were airtight. There was no way out. Meanwhile, Charles sat back in his office, watching the storm unfold from his glass-paneled desk. He wasn't worried. He knew it was only a matter of time before the airline's board would be forced to accept the offer. The legal battles, the resistance, it was all part of the game. But Charles wasn't just playing for the short term. He had bigger plans. At this point, it wasn't just about taking over an airline. It was about sending a message, one that no one could ignore. He wanted them to know that he was not someone to be underestimated. And that flight attendant, Jenna, she had no idea the ripple effect her actions had set in motion. In the quiet of his office, as he watched the negotiations unfold on his computer screen, Charles smiled to himself. This wasn't just a business deal. It was personal. And in just a few hours, the world would know it. The airline's once powerful executives would be forced to sit across from him at a table, offering him control of their company. But there was one final piece of the puzzle. Charles knew that as soon as the deal was finalized, he'd make his next move. He wasn't going to just take control quietly. No, he wanted to make a statement to the entire world, to every person who had ever doubted him. And he had the perfect plan. By the time the clock struck noon, Charles received the call he had been waiting for. It was Gregory again, his voice steady but laced with urgency. "It's done. The board has agreed to the deal. They've signed off on the acquisition. You now officially own the airline." Charles leaned back in his chair, a wave of satisfaction washing over him. He had expected it, of course, but hearing the words confirmed it. The airline that had humiliated him on that plane was now his. The deal had gone through without a hitch. All the sleepless nights, the phone calls, the pressure. It had paid off. He had won. But even as the weight of his success settled in, a part of him felt that this was just the beginning. "Good," Charles said, his voice calm. "Now make sure the media gets the press release. I want the entire world to know who owns this airline. It's time for them to learn who they're really dealing with." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line before Gregory responded. "You sure you want to make a public statement like that? It's going to make waves. The press is already on it with the story of what happened on the plane, and now this. I mean, you're making a serious splash." Charles smiled, but it wasn't a smile of joy. It was a smile of calculated intent. "Exactly. Let them talk. Let them speculate. But the truth is, this isn't just about the airline. It's about me. and it's about sending a message to anyone who thinks they can make me look small. They need to understand that no one disrespects me, not in my world." As the call ended, Charles felt a strange mix of satisfaction and anticipation. He had pulled off something that no one thought was possible, something that would be talked about for years. But there was still one final step. He wasn't going to just let the media hype this up and walk away quietly. No, he was going to make sure that his name was forever tied to the airline, that his ownership would leave a lasting impression. Within hours, the press release was out, and the story hit the headlines like wildfire. Billionaire Charles Blackwood purchases airline name after public confrontation on flight, the title screamed. News outlets from all over the world were covering the story, each with their own spin. Some called it an act of revenge, others a business genius move. But no one had predicted what would happen next. The coverage of the takeover was everywhere. Major news stations were airing footage of the incident on the plane, followed by shots of Charles standing confidently outside the airline's headquarters in front of the press. He wasn't just the man who bought an airline. He was the man who had been disrespected and turned that disrespect into a billion-dollar acquisition. But the real surprise came later that evening, when Charles made his way to the corporate offices. He had one final act to play. It wasn't enough to just own the airline now. He wanted to make sure that every single person in that building knew exactly who was in charge. He walked into the boardroom, where the remaining executives, including CEO David Clarkson, were gathered for an emergency meeting. The tension in the room was palpable. They had been expecting to discuss how to handle the takeover, but they hadn't expected this. Charles, dressed in his usual sharp suit, walked to the front of the room with a calm, almost casual demeanor. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice cutting through the air, "I trust we can start the meeting now. I'd like to begin by introducing myself. I'm the new owner of Airline name, and I've come to make a few changes." The executives, clearly rattled, exchanged uncomfortable glances. Clarkson tried to compose himself, standing up to shake Charles's hand. "Mr. Blackwood," he said, his voice tight, we didn't expect this, but we'll do whatever we can to ensure the transition is smooth." Charles didn't respond with the expected pleasantries. Instead, he looked directly at Clarkson, his eyes steely and unwavering. "I don't need smooth," Charles said flatly. "I need control. I didn't buy this airline to sit around. I bought it because I was disrespected. And now, it's time for you all to understand who holds the power here." The room went silent. Clarkson, now visibly tense, nodded. But Charles could tell that he wasn't fully grasping the magnitude of what had just happened. It wasn't just business. It was personal. Charles had made his move, and no one was going to take that away from him. He turned to leave the room, but before he did, he gave one final, chilling remark. "I trust that you'll all do your jobs until the end of the week. After that, we'll be discussing new leadership." With that, he walked out, leaving the room in stunned silence. Outside, the media was already waiting for him. Reporters shouted questions as Charles made his way through the crowd, his face composed. He was done with small talk. He had bigger plans ahead, and this was just the beginning of what he intended to build. As he drove away from the building, he couldn't help but smile. The flight attendant who had kicked him off that plane, she would never forget this day, and neither would anyone else. The next few days were a whirlwind for Charles. News outlets were buzzing with the details of his unexpected acquisition of the airline, and everywhere he went, people seemed to be talking about it. The media coverage was relentless, but Charles didn't mind. He thrived in the chaos. It wasn't just about the takeover anymore, it was about control. He had made a move that no one saw coming, and now everyone was scrambling to catch up. Inside the airline's headquarters, the executives were in damage control mode. CEO David Clarkson and the board members, all of whom had been blindsided by Charles's aggressive takeover, were working overtime to adjust to the new reality. But Charles wasn't interested in their apologies or their reassurances. He had already made it clear that he wasn't there to play nice. On the third day after the acquisition, Charles called a meeting with his new management team. The room was packed with some of the airline's top executives, most of them uncomfortable with the sudden change in leadership. Charles, however, seemed completely at ease. He sat at the head of the table, a confident smile playing on his lips as he looked around at the anxious faces in front of him. "I'm sure some of you have questions," he began, his voice steady and commanding. "But before we get into all that, let me make one thing clear. I'm not here to run a company the way it's been run for years. This airline is going to be different. It's going to be efficient. It's going to be profitable. And most importantly, it's going to respect people, from the ground crew to the passengers." The room was still as Charles spoke. No one dared interrupt. The air was thick with tension as they waited to see what he would say next. "I've heard a lot of complaints about this company's culture," he continued, leaning forward slightly. "I've heard that employees are overworked and underappreciated. I've heard that customers are treated like they don't matter. That's going to change, and it's going to change right now. We're not going to be the airline that people dread flying with. We're going to be the airline people choose because they know we care about their experience. And if any of you think that's too much to ask, I suggest you start looking for another job. Because I don't tolerate mediocrity." The executives exchanged uncomfortable glances. Charles could see the unease in their eyes, but he didn't care. This was his show now, and it was time to set the tone. He wasn't interested in playing the political games that had plagued the airline for years. He was here to make changes, and make them fast. As the meeting went on, Charles outlined a series of sweeping reforms. He talked about streamlining operations, improving customer service, and even cutting unnecessary costs. But the most important change he announced was the restructuring of the management team. He wasn't afraid to make enemies. The people who had allowed the airline to stagnate, who had let things slide for too long, would be gone. The culture of complacency was over. When the meeting finally wrapped up, Charles stood up, signaling the end of the session. As the executives filed out of the room, most of them walked with their heads down, clearly shaken by the way Charles had turned everything upside down in just a few days. But Charles wasn't concerned with their discomfort. He had made his point. No one would challenge him. No one would treat him like a nobody. But there was still the matter of Jenna, the flight attendant who had started this whole chain of events. Charles had thought about her every day since the incident. At first, it had been a fleeting thought, something that annoyed him but he could brush off. But now, after everything he had done, he realized she was more than just an annoyance. She was a symbol of how people underestimated him. She had no idea who she had been dealing with, and Charles wasn't the kind of man who would let that slide. He wasn't sure yet what he would do about Jenna, but one thing was certain: she wouldn't get off easy. This wasn't a matter of revenge. It was about making a point. In the world Charles operated in, no one got to disrespect him and walk away without consequences. As the day wore on, Charles sat in his office, looking over the final details of the airline's new policies. He was already thinking ahead, planning the next steps. The media coverage of the takeover had already started to fade, but Charles was determined to keep the momentum going. He wanted everyone to know that this wasn't just a one-time deal. This was the beginning of something much bigger. He had his sights set on more acquisitions, more power, and more influence. And no one was going to get in his way. But as Charles turned his attention to the airline's future, one thought lingered in the back of his mind. Jenna, the woman who had kicked him off that plane. She had no idea how much she had changed the course of her own life with that one decision, and Charles would make sure she remembered it. As the days passed, Charles's grip on the airline grew tighter. The sweeping changes he had implemented were beginning to take effect. The corporate atmosphere was shifting from one of complacency to one of high-stakes efficiency. Some employees were skeptical, unsure of how the new leadership would affect their day-to-day lives, but many others welcomed the change. They could feel the difference. Things were moving faster, decisions were being made with authority, and there was a clear sense that the company was no longer drifting. Charles was relentless in his efforts to reshape the airline's culture. He held weekly meetings with the department heads, demanding progress reports and offering little patience for delays. If an employee wasn't pulling their weight, they were quickly shown the door. Charles had no tolerance for mediocrity, and the results began to show almost immediately. Stock prices rose, customer satisfaction improved, and even the staff in the terminals seemed more motivated. But even as he focused on the day-to-day operations of his new company, one thing still weighed heavily on his mind: Jenna, the flight attendant who had started this whole saga. Charles hadn't forgotten her. In fact, he couldn't stop thinking about the way she had treated him that day on the plane. To her, he was just another passenger. But to him, that moment had been an insult, one that he had turned into an empire. He couldn't let it go. It was clear now that this wasn't just about owning an airline. It was about proving a point. Jenna, the young flight attendant, had thought she could humiliate him. But now Charles was in charge of her world, her airline, her company, her job. He didn't need to act in the heat of anger. No, this was going to be calculated. He had time. And time, as he knew well, was his most powerful ally. Charles was known for his patience, for his ability to wait for the perfect moment. And that moment, he realized, would come soon. He had been given a platform to reshape everything, and he intended to use it to make sure everyone in the company understood the consequences of underestimating him. But Charles wasn't going to move against Jenna blindly. He wanted to make sure her lesson was one that would stick, not just for her, but for everyone watching. He started to quietly investigate her background, her career history, the little details that most people wouldn't notice. It didn't take long for his team to find the information he needed. Jenna had worked her way up from a small regional airline, taking a job at this major company with dreams of advancing, of building a career. She wasn't anyone special, not yet at least. But what intrigued Charles was her sense of entitlement, her belief that she could make decisions without considering the bigger picture. He learned that she had been with the airline for only a couple of years, but in that short time, she had managed to climb into a position where she felt empowered to challenge a billionaire. That wasn't the kind of behavior Charles tolerated. No one had the right to undermine him, especially not someone who had barely proven themselves in the industry. And so, Charles devised a plan. It wasn't about firing her on the spot or making her a public spectacle. No, that would be too easy. Instead, he decided he would put her in a position where she would have to acknowledge the power he now held. He would make her understand, in no uncertain terms, that her actions had consequences. But this wasn't going to be some quick, hasty retaliation. Charles wasn't interested in childish revenge. He was thinking bigger. He instructed his HR department to quietly gather all the information they could on Jenna's professional history within the company. Her performance reviews, her disciplinary records, any complaints filed against her, and even her relationships with other staff members. If there was anything that could be used to question her competence or her ability to do her job, Charles would make sure it came to light. But the key part of his plan was how he would approach Jenna when the time came. When he finally decided to make his move, it would be in front of her peers, in front of her colleagues, where she would feel the weight of the situation. It wasn't just about reprimanding her. It was about showing her, and everyone watching, that Charles Blackwood was not someone to be crossed. He wanted to make sure that Jenna knew exactly who was in charge of the airline now. The same way she had humiliated him by kicking him off that plane, he would make sure her career at the airline would never be the same, but he would do it in a way that would leave her with no escape. He would remove her from the company with a precision that would make it clear to everyone in the room that he was always 3 steps ahead, and when it was over, no one, especially not Jenna, would ever doubt his power again. It wasn't long before Charles's plan started taking shape. His team had gathered all the information they needed about Jenna, her reviews, her time with the airline, and the numerous complaints about her attitude from passengers. Though Jenna had managed to hide some of her shortcomings behind her sharp, no-nonsense exterior, Charles could see the cracks. It was all there. A flight attendant who thought she was above reproach, A person who believed her position gave her the right to make decisions without understanding the full consequences. But Charles wasn't in any rush to act. He wanted to give it time to simmer, to ensure that when he made his move, it would be the right moment, the one that would hit hardest. The last thing he wanted was for anyone to think that his decision was rash or based on emotion. This was about strategy. And as always, Charles was willing to wait for the perfect time. Days turned into a week, and while the corporate restructuring continued under his watchful eye, he began to focus more on Jenna's movements. He kept a careful eye on the in-flight schedules, monitoring her shifts and her assignments. He didn't want to make it too obvious, didn't want her to feel watched, but he needed to ensure that when he did act, she wouldn't have any chance to argue her way out of it. Finally, the day came. Charles had just returned to the office after a quick meeting with one of his financial partners, when he was told that Jenna would be working a high-profile flight, the kind of flight that received attention from both the media and industry insiders. It was a perfect opportunity. Charles knew this was the moment he had been waiting for. The flight would be a turning point, a public spectacle. If he could use it to his advantage, everyone in the airline would understand the consequences of defying him. The press had already been watching closely, following the story of the airline's takeover and its rapid transformation under Charles's leadership. He knew that if he made his move now, the media would be there to catch every moment, to amplify the message he wanted to send. Charles didn't waste time. He called his head of operations and instructed him to arrange for a team of PR representatives to be present on the flight, just in case things went public in an unexpected way. He also told his security team to monitor the situation discreetly, ensuring everything went according to plan. Jenna wouldn't know what hit her. That evening, as the plane prepared for takeoff, Charles arrived at the airline's terminal, his presence commanding attention even among the airport's bustling activity. He didn't need to be flashy or show off. His power was understood without the need for extra display. Jenna was there, just as he expected, and she was in the middle of an argument with another crew member about some last-minute changes to the flight schedule. It was clear that she was frustrated, and Charles knew exactly how to use this to his advantage. This was the woman who had thought nothing of kicking him off a plane just days earlier, who had been so quick to belittle him. Charles walked calmly through the terminal, his eyes scanning the room until they locked onto her. Jenna was in the middle of talking to a few other crew members when she caught sight of him. The recognition was instant. She froze. For a split second, there was a flicker of panic in her eyes. But then she quickly regained her composure, straightening up and offering a polite, if strained, smile. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, trying to sound professional, but there was no mistaking the tension in her voice. "Is there something I can do for you?" Charles didn't return her greeting with the usual pleasantries. He didn't need to. Instead, he looked her dead in the eye and spoke in a calm, controlled tone that was somehow more intimidating than any shout could have been. "I believe there's something we need to discuss, Jenna," he said, his words slow and deliberate. "I've been made aware of your behavior during our last interaction, and I think you should know I don't tolerate people who think they can disrespect me without consequences." Jenna's face paled slightly, but she didn't flinch. She tried to hide her unease with a forced smile, but Charles could see the tension in her posture. "I didn't," she began, but he cut her off with a single gesture, his finger raised as if to silence her. "You made a choice," Charles said firmly. "A choice that was disrespectful, not only to me but to the entire company. You think you're above the rules, that ends today." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle between them. The room was silent. The surrounding crew members had backed off slightly, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. Jenna was stuck in the spotlight now, and she knew it. "I've already spoken with HR," Charles continued. "Effective immediately, you are relieved of your duties with Airline name. I don't need someone with your attitude representing this company." He let the finality of his statement linger before adding, "Your departure will be handled quietly, but I want you to understand this. The way you treated me wasn't just a minor incident. It was a statement. And now I'm making mine. Jenna's face reddened with anger and embarrassment, but she didn't dare respond. What could she say? She knew, just as he did, that this wasn't a simple firing. It was a calculated public humiliation. Her pride wouldn't let her show weakness, but she could feel the floor shifting beneath her. Charles turned to leave, but before he did, he gave her one last glance. "I hope you learn something from this," he said coldly. "It's not just about what you do, it's about who you do it to, and you will never forget who you crossed." Without another word, Charles walked out of the terminal, leaving behind a stunned and humiliated Jenna, who stood frozen in place. As the door clicked shut behind him, he knew he had made his point, not just to her, but to everyone watching. And in the coming days, the media would be full of stories about the mysterious, swift downfall of one of the airline's top employees. But the bigger story was still unfolding. Charles Blackwood was a man to be feared, and no one, no matter how small their role, would dare challenge him again. The next few days brought a whirlwind of media attention. The story of Jenna's sudden and very public firing spread quickly. News outlets, social media, and even passengers who had been on the flight began to share the details of what had happened. Some called it ruthless, others called it justified. But one thing was clear: Charles Blackwood had made his point. The message was simple: never underestimate him. For Charles, this wasn't about revenge. It was about setting a precedent. He needed everyone in the company, and even the industry at large, to understand that his word was final. No one would dare treat him like an ordinary man again. And while the media continued to cover Jenna's downfall, Charles remained focused on the bigger picture, consolidating his power and ensuring that the airline's new direction was firmly set in place. Behind closed doors, the board members and executives who had once been nervous about the changes were starting to see the benefits of Charles's leadership. Under his guidance, the airline's stock was climbing steadily, and its operational efficiency was improving faster than anyone had expected. There were still skeptics, of course, but the results spoke for themselves. Charles didn't waste time basking in the glory of his victory, though. He knew that the world wouldn't be satisfied with just one bold move. They were already beginning to forget. Jenna's name was starting to fade from the headlines, and the public's attention was turning elsewhere. But Charles had a plan to keep them watching, something that would solidify his position as a force to be reckoned with. That's when he decided to hold a company-wide meeting, one that would serve as both a strategic update and a very public reminder of his authority. The entire management team and key staff members were invited to attend, including those who had been brought in by the previous leadership. Charles had always believed in being direct, and today, he planned to show them just how serious he was. The day of the meeting arrived, and the room was packed with executives, staff, and key figures from all departments. The mood was expectant, even a little tense as everyone took their seats, unsure of what to expect. They knew the company had changed under Charles's leadership, but no one could predict what he would do next. When Charles walked into the room, the atmosphere shifted. He was a man who commanded respect, and his presence alone made everyone sit up straighter. There was no grand entrance, no flashy showmanship. He simply walked to the front, stood tall, and addressed the room. "Good morning," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I don't need to tell you all how far this company has come in the last week. You've seen the results. We're moving in the right direction. But I'm not here to talk about numbers today. I'm here to talk about standards." He paused, letting the word hang in the air for a moment before continuing. "When I bought this airline, it wasn't just for the assets or the stock or the fancy jets. It was because I knew there was untapped potential here. But potential means nothing if we don't live up to the standards I'm setting. This company will be built on respect, accountability, and hard work. If you're not willing to meet those standards, you won't last here. Simple as that." There was a murmur among the group, some nodding in agreement, others looking uneasy. Charles could see the mixed reactions. Some were on board with the new direction, Others were still unsure. But he didn't care about the unsure ones. He was building a team of people who would either rise to the challenge or fall by the wayside. "This company is going to be a force in the airline industry," Charles continued. "But we won't get there if we continue to allow people to cut corners or slack off. Everyone here, from the ground crew to the flight attendants, needs to know that we don't just talk about excellence. We demand it. If you can't keep up, you'll be shown the door." He made eye contact with each executive as he spoke, ensuring that no one in the room could doubt his commitment to this vision. The room was quiet now, the weight of his words settling in. "We've made a lot of changes already, and we'll continue to do so. I've already begun a review of the leadership team, and some of you will be taking on new roles. Others," he paused, his eyes narrowing, "will be leaving. You've had your chance. If you want to stay, you'll need to show me that you're all in. If not, well, I'm sure you'll find other opportunities elsewhere." The tension in the room was palpable. No one dared speak. Charles had made it clear. There would be no room for weakness, no tolerance for anyone who didn't align with his vision. Those who had been comfortable in their old roles, coasting along without real challenge, would have to step up or step out. "And one last thing," Charles said, his voice growing even more serious. "I don't want to hear any more stories of any employees being treated with disrespect. This is a company that values people, not just profits. I won't tolerate anyone undermining that. Understood?" The room nodded in unison. There was no room for negotiation. Charles's vision was clear, and those who had stayed in the room thus far knew that they had no choice but to fall in line. There was no escaping his influence. As the meeting concluded and people began to file out, Charles felt the weight of the moment. This was the turning point. No one would be able to deny his authority now. He had transformed not just the airline, but the entire company culture. His presence was undeniable, and in the weeks to come, those who had doubted him, those who had thought they could get by without stepping up to the challenge, would begin to fall away. Charles wasn't just going to own this airline, he was going to reshape it into his own image. It was only a matter of time before everyone understood what had happened. The flight attendant who had kicked him off the plane would become a distant memory, replaced by a story of power, determination, and ruthless success. And Charles Blackwood would forever be known as the man who took control, not just of an airline, but of his destiny. As the days turned into weeks, Charles continued to consolidate his power over the airline. His vision was becoming a reality, and the changes he'd promised were starting to take hold in every corner of the business. Employees who had once coasted through their jobs were now working at full capacity, motivated by the fear of being cut if they didn't meet the new, higher standards. The culture of mediocrity that had plagued the company for years was being dismantled piece by piece. But even as he reveled in the success of his aggressive restructuring, there was one lingering thought in the back of his mind. Jenna. Her face had haunted him in the days following her departure. Her defiance, her refusal to see him for who he really was. It had pushed him to make a statement, to show her, and everyone else, that crossing Charles Blackwood had consequences. But as the weeks went on, Charles began to feel that the moment of her firing, while satisfying, wasn't enough. It wasn't the closure he had hoped for. He needed to finish what he had started. Jenna hadn't been just another employee to dismiss. She had been the spark. She was the reason he had taken over this airline in the first place, and now he needed to make sure that she, and everyone else, understood the full scale of his power. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about rewriting the narrative, about cementing his legacy, not just as the owner of an airline, but as a man who could shape destinies. He wasn't going to let Jenna's exit fade into the background of the company's rapid transformation. No, he wanted her name tied to his, in a way that would make her remember the mistake she'd made for the rest of her life. Charles had the resources to make it happen. With just a few keystrokes, he could change the course of anyone's future, and that's exactly what he planned to do. He had his PR team do a deep dive into Jenna's life after she was let go. They found that, not surprisingly, she was struggling to land another job in the industry. Her reputation had taken a hit. Word had gotten around about the flight attendant who had crossed Charles Blackwood. But Charles wanted more than just a career setback for her. He wanted to make sure that she would never again work in the industry she had loved so much. He wanted to make sure that the stigma of disrespecting Charles Blackwood would follow her wherever she went. That's when he took it to the next level. Charles called in his legal team. "I want you to make sure that Jenna can never work as a flight attendant again," he instructed. "We're going to get ahead of the story and make sure it's known why she was let go. Let's use her own actions to build the case." The legal team went to work. They quietly reached out to industry insiders, key decision makers at other airlines, and anyone who might be in a position to offer her a job. They carefully crafted a narrative that placed the blame squarely on Jenna's shoulders. She had defied company policy, acted unprofessionally, and ultimately failed to recognize the gravity of her actions. They also made sure to highlight her previous disciplinary record, painting her as a liability for any company that would consider hiring her. Charles was playing a long game. He didn't need to act swiftly. He needed to make sure the story stuck, that the image of Jenna as an insubordinate and unprofessional employee became a permanent part of her public record. Her reputation would be so tarnished that no one would want to risk hiring her. In the meantime, Charles took every opportunity to reinforce his position of power in public. He was a master of the media, and he knew how to keep the spotlight on himself. He made appearances at industry conferences, talked to the press about his plans for the airline's future, and continued to make bold, decisive moves that left competitors scrambling to catch up. Every time he spoke, it was with the kind of authority that only someone in complete control could command. No one questioned his decisions. Behind the scenes, the legal team was working tirelessly, sending out letters to other airlines, blocking Jenna from gaining any real traction. A few weeks later, a quiet announcement went out through the industry grapevine. Former flight attendant Jenna Richards had been permanently blacklisted from major airlines due to unprofessional conduct during her employment at Airline name. The story spread quickly, and though it wasn't covered in the mainstream news, those in the industry took notice. The message was clear. Jenna had made a mistake, and now she would pay for it. Every time someone mentioned her name, it would be followed by the reminder of why she was no longer in the skies. Meanwhile, Charles's airline was thriving. The restructuring was complete. Customer satisfaction was up. Employee morale was high, or at least those who were still working. And the company's stock was hitting new highs. He had turned a negative, a simple moment of disrespect, into an entire empire built on his vision of excellence and ruthlessness. Charles sat in his office one afternoon, reviewing the latest financial reports, a satisfied smile playing across his face. He had achieved everything he had set out to do. The airline was his. The media feared him. And as for Jenna, she was a distant memory, one that would follow her for the rest of her life. And that's when he realized this wasn't just about taking control of an airline. It was about sending a message to the world. No one, not even a flight attendant, could challenge him and get away with it. He had proven that. As Charles continued to navigate the ever-expanding landscape of his airline empire, he became acutely aware of the power he had amassed, not just financially, but in the public eye. He was no longer just a billionaire tech mogul who dabbled in acquisitions. He was a force in the aviation industry, a name that people recognized and feared. Every time he made a decision, whether it was about the airline's future or about how to handle an individual, it sent ripples through the market and through the media. His control was absolute, and he made sure everyone knew it. In the weeks following Jenna's downfall, the airline continued to thrive. But Charles wasn't satisfied with just keeping things running smoothly. He wanted more. The competitive landscape in the airline industry was cutthroat, and while he had already taken a significant share, there were still others to challenge. Charles had made it clear that he wasn't interested in simply coasting. He was looking to dominate. The next move was expansion. Charles had always been strategic, and now, with the airline under his control, it was time to push beyond its current boundaries. His goal? To acquire a smaller competitor, a regional airline that had been making waves in the industry. Its growth potential was immense, but it lacked the resources to break into the larger market. Charles saw this as the perfect opportunity to flex his muscles once again. The acquisition process was swift and, as always, brutal. Charles didn't waste time negotiating or playing games. He offered a deal that was too good for the smaller airline's board members to refuse, and they didn't. Within a matter of weeks, the deal was done, and Charles added yet another feather to his already decorated cap. The acquisition sent a message not just to the airline industry, but to anyone who might be watching. Charles Blackwood was a man who got what he wanted, and he got it fast. With this new acquisition, Charles immediately began making changes. He brought in his trusted team of executives, the ones who had helped him rebuild his airline from the ground up, and together they began to integrate the smaller airline's operations into his. As with every acquisition, there were those who didn't agree with his methods, but Charles didn't care. The airline's culture would adapt to him, or it would break. The integration was not without its challenges. There were internal power struggles, disagreements over how best to combine the two companies, and growing pains as the larger airline swallowed the smaller one. But Charles, ever the visionary, knew that these were simply hurdles to clear on his way to the top, and clear them he did. Within a few months, the combined airline was stronger than ever. Its reach was broader, its reputation for efficiency and customer service was cemented, and its stock price soared. Investors, seeing the clear direction Charles was taking, jumped on board, propelling the company to new heights. And yet, despite all the successes, there was still one thing Charles hadn't fully addressed. The one person whose actions had sparked this whole chain of events. Jenna. He had made her an example, but now he realized that it wasn't just about making her a cautionary tale. It was about making sure she stayed a cautionary tale. For the first time in weeks, Charles began to think about her again, wondering if she had learned her lesson. But more importantly, he began to wonder if there was more to be done. He had already ruined her career in the airline industry, but in a way, he realized that was just the beginning. He could make sure that her name remained linked to his for years to come, and he would. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon when Charles sat down at his desk, a glass of scotch in hand, contemplating his next move. The acquisition was a success, and the company was flourishing. But something nagged at him, something that hadn't quite settled. Jenna's name kept creeping into his thoughts, like an itch that wouldn't go away. Charles wasn't a man who believed in coincidences. Jenna had challenged him, and he had come out on top. But she wasn't just any flight attendant. She had made a conscious choice to disregard him, to treat him as though he were just another ordinary passenger. And in doing so, she had set in motion a series of events that would reshape the industry. He had to ensure that no one would forget the lesson he had taught her. And so, Charles began to plan again. It started with a simple idea. If he could make Jenna's downfall permanent, then he could make sure no one would ever dare to cross him again. But he wasn't going to stop with just the airline industry. No, this was going to be bigger. Jenna had become a symbol of defiance, of someone who thought they could get away with disrespecting him. Charles would ensure that her name was forever linked to his, no matter where she went, no matter what she tried to do. The first step was to ensure that her blacklist from the airline industry remained firmly in place. He contacted his legal team once more, instructing them to quietly spread the word among competitors. His connections within the aviation world were deep, and he used every one of them to ensure that no airline, big or small, would ever consider hiring her. No one would be willing to risk the bad press or the association with Charles's public enemy. But Charles wasn't stopping there. He had the power, the resources, and the influence to push things further. Through his network of media contacts, he began to plant stories about Jenna's unprofessionalism and the dangerous precedent she had set by defying a powerful industry leader like Charles. He made sure to emphasize how her behavior had led to the downfall of her career, and how she had burned bridges with some of the most powerful figures in the business. As the weeks passed, Jenna became a cautionary tale, not just in the airline industry, but across various media platforms. Articles appeared in industry magazines, on news websites, and in business publications, all mentioning her by name, usually with the words unprofessional, defiant, and disrespectful attached to it. The media frenzy surrounding her collapse was hard to ignore, and it became clear that her career, such as it was finished. Charles had done it. He had ensured that Jenna's name would forever be synonymous with failure in the airline industry. She would never again have the opportunity to rebuild her career. And he was content. His power was undisputed, his control complete. But Charles knew that no matter how much he had accomplished, he couldn't rest on his laurels. There was always more to be done, more to conquer. His eyes remained fixed on the horizon, thinking about the next acquisition, the next expansion, the next move. But deep down, he knew that no matter how much he achieved, it would always come back to that moment on the plane. The moment when Jenna had tried to humiliate him. That was the moment that had sparked everything, and now he had ensured that the world would never forget it. The months that followed were a blur of successes, acquisitions, and public appearances. Charles's name was now synonymous with power in the airline industry. He had turned a small, seemingly insignificant moment of disrespect into a billion-dollar empire. But despite the outward success, something inside Charles had begun to change. He had always been driven, always had his eyes on the next goal, the next target. But now, as he looked out over his rapidly growing empire, he felt something he had never quite experienced before. A sense of emptiness. The victory over Jenna had been sweet, but it was also fleeting. He had secured his dominance, proven his strength, and cemented his legacy. Yet, it didn't feel like enough. Charles had come to realize that it wasn't just about business anymore. It wasn't just about making money or taking control. Somewhere along the way, the need for power had overtaken him. And now, he found himself asking a question that hadn't occurred to him before. What was the point of all this? In the solitude of his office, surrounded by papers and reports that no longer seemed to matter, Charles began to question his choices. Was he doing all of this for the right reasons? Or had he become the very thing he once despised? The ruthless businessman who crushed everything in his path to achieve his goals. He poured himself another drink, staring out the window at the skyline. The world had changed for him, but had he changed for the better? It was a question that lingered in his mind, but one that he couldn't yet answer. As the days turned into weeks, Charles found himself struggling with a deeper sense of restlessness. The satisfaction he once felt with each new acquisition, each deal struck, seemed to wane with time. His empire had expanded beyond his wildest dreams, but now, standing at the apex of his success, he felt a strange void that no amount of wealth or power seemed to fill. The adrenaline that had once fueled him through the toughest of battles, whether in business or personal vendettas, began to feel hollow. It wasn't that the triumphs didn't feel good, it was that they no longer felt enough. When he had first taken control of the airline, everything had seemed like a game, a challenge to prove his superiority to those who had underestimated him. But now that he had won, now that he had achieved the impossible, the victory no longer held the same thrill. He'd conquered his foes, secured his place in the business world, and built a legacy that would last for generations. Yet he found himself asking, what comes next? Charles sat at his desk, a pile of reports and corporate memos spread out in front of him. He had once reveled in the minutiae of these documents, meticulously checking the figures, planning the next strategic move. But today, the numbers seemed irrelevant. His mind drifted back to the days before the airline acquisition, when his life had been less complicated, when his ambition had been pure, untethered by the weight of the empire he now carried. It wasn't just the emptiness that bothered him. It was the realization that he had become something he hadn't intended to be. His victory over Jenna, while satisfying at the time, had turned into an obsession. He hadn't just removed her from the industry, he had ensured her destruction. And for what? To prove a point? To send a message? He had done it all. But was it worth it? Charles pushed the reports aside, leaned back in his chair, and stared out the window. The world was full of opportunity, full of challenges waiting to be tackled. And yet, here he was, wondering if the chase was still worth the prize. The more he thought about it, the more he realized something he hadn't fully understood before. He had become a man defined by his victories, but his victories had no meaning if he didn't know why he was fighting in the first place. What had started as a desire to rise above had evolved into a need to crush, to dominate. But now that he had done that, he found himself wondering whether this kind of success was sustainable. Could he continue to fight if the only enemy left was himself? He needed something more than just power. He needed to find a new purpose, one that wasn't just about proving his strength, but about finding peace within his own accomplishments. Perhaps it was time to step back, to reevaluate his life and his priorities. But where to begin? Charles decided to take a break from the relentless pace he had set for himself. For the first time in years, he considered stepping away from the corporate world, just for a little while. He had the resources to do so. Endless money, an army of advisors, and a business that could run without him for a while. It was time to step out of the boardrooms and strategy sessions and take a look at the world from a different perspective. The idea of a break wasn't as easy as it sounded. Charles wasn't used to sitting still. He had spent his entire life building, striving, conquering. But now, the idea of slowing down seemed oddly appealing. So, he made the decision to take a brief hiatus from the daily grind, something that would give him the space to reflect, to reconnect with his core values, and perhaps figure out what was truly missing. He booked a trip to the Caribbean, a place where he could disconnect from the world of business, where the only things he would have to think about were the ocean and the sky. He knew that some of his closest associates would question his decision, but he didn't care. He needed to do this for himself. The island was quiet, a stark contrast to the buzz of Manhattan and the never-ending noise of his corporate empire. The gentle sound of the waves crashing against the shore was soothing, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Charles allowed himself to relax. He spent his days lounging on the beach, taking long walks, reading books he had put off for years, and meeting locals who had no idea who he was. He was just another visitor in a paradise that seemed untouched by the pressures of the world he had left behind. But even in this serene setting, his mind would often wander back to the business. He couldn't escape the nagging feeling that something was missing. It wasn't the empire. It wasn't the acquisitions or the victories that had once defined him. It was the sense of purpose, the drive he had felt when he was building his fortune, when every decision seemed like it was leading to something greater. As he sat on the balcony one evening watching the sunset, a thought struck him. Maybe the reason he felt so empty was that he had stopped building for the sake of building. He had started playing a different game, one that was less about creating and more about maintaining control, about holding power for the sake of power. He had become trapped by his own success. Could it be possible to start over? To take the pieces of his empire and create something new? Something that wasn't driven by ego or the desire for dominance, but by something more meaningful? The thought was both terrifying and liberating, but it was a thought worth exploring. After a week of solitude, Charles returned from his trip with a new sense of clarity. He hadn't fully figured out all the answers, but something had shifted during his time away. He understood now that the satisfaction he had been seeking wasn't going to come from more acquisitions or more power. It wasn't going to come from making others fear him or forcing respect through sheer force of will. For the first time, he thought about the people he had left behind, the employees who had been part of his rise, the ones who had worked hard to help him achieve his vision. He had always seen them as tools, as means to an end, but now he was starting to wonder if he had been wrong. What if the true value of his empire lay not in how much he owned, but in how he treated those who helped him build it? Charles sat down with his top executives and advisors and began to rethink the direction of the airline. He wasn't going to abandon the company. He still believed in its potential. But he wanted to reshape the way it operated, to make it something more than just a financial powerhouse. He wanted it to stand for something, for integrity, for respect, for growth that didn't come at the expense of others. He started by instituting new leadership programs for his employees, focusing on mentorship and professional development. He committed to more sustainable practices in the company's operations and began pushing for corporate social responsibility projects. His advisors were skeptical at first. This wasn't the Charles they had known, the ruthless businessman who cared only about the bottom line. But over time, they began to see the shift. They saw that Charles wasn't just trying to make money anymore. He was trying to make a difference. But the change wasn't just in the business. It was in Charles himself. He found himself seeking balance in his life, setting aside time to spend with family, reconnecting with old friends, and even volunteering for causes he had long ignored. He knew he couldn't undo the past, but he could create a new future, one that wasn't defined by conquest and dominance, but by something more meaningful: growth, purpose, and maybe even redemption. As Charles reflected on his journey, he realized that his greatest victory wasn't in owning the airline or destroying his enemies. It was in reclaiming his humanity. And while the road ahead would still be full of challenges, for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was heading in the right direction. As Charles began to implement changes in the company, he noticed a shift in the way people responded to him. The respect that had once been built solely on fear was now starting to come from something deeper. His executives, once wary of his more ruthless tactics, were beginning to trust him again, not because they feared his power, but because they saw him trying to build something better, something more meaningful. He wasn't the same man he had been when he first took control of the airline. Charles had learned that power alone didn't make a man strong. It was how he used that power to lift others. Slowly but surely, he began to cultivate a culture of collaboration, growth, and opportunity within the company. He invested more in employee well-being, launched initiatives to give back to the communities the airline served, and made it clear that no one, no matter their position, was above the core values of respect and integrity. But while Charles had changed, some old habits were harder to break. His ambition was still a driving force, and though he no longer sought to crush his enemies, he wasn't about to stop expanding. The airline's success continued to grow, and with every new acquisition or partnership, Charles felt that familiar thrill. But this time, it wasn't driven by a desire to conquer. It was driven by the challenge of building something that would last, something that would leave a legacy beyond wealth. Months passed, and Charles's transformation became clear. The company flourished under his new leadership, and he found a balance between ambition and compassion. His relationships with employees, once transactional, had evolved into genuine connections. People weren't just working for him, they were working with him. He had finally answered the question that had haunted him: what comes next? The answer was simple: growth, but with purpose. Charles understood that success didn't come from dominating others. It came from building a foundation that could sustain itself long after he was gone. As he looked out over his empire, he no longer felt the emptiness he once had. He knew that he would never forget the lessons he had learned, especially from the flight attendant who had kicked him off the plane all those months ago. But now, instead of seeing her as a symbol of disrespect, he saw her as the catalyst for his own transformation. And that, he realized, was the true victory. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure to subscribe to the channel for more amazing videos just like this. See you in the next one.